Thanks everyone for being at this conference. We appreciate your support and encouragement, and it's great to be here. Now, the topic this morning, and I've tried to make this simple in a sense, not simplistic, but easy to understand because this is a family conference. So it's good to talk about fossils and how fossils form and how they relate to the flood. What is a fossil? People often ask that. Well, this is the official definition from the American Geological Institute. Any remains, trace or imprint of a plant or animal that has been preserved in the Earth's rocks since some past geological prehistoric, that's their time, that's their way of saying it. Of course, there's always been history. There's no such thing as prehistory. History began when God began it. It's evidence of past life. Loosely speaking, it's any evidence of past life. So there's a variety of things that we see as fossils. Most people are familiar with shells and bones and leaves and wood. Sometimes the original material is still there, sometimes it's not. It's been altered or preserved by being mineralised with something else or replaced. And we'll talk about this in a moment in more detail. Moulds and casts are left behind. The original shell material or bone material is gone, and we're left with moulds or casts. And there could be footprints, tracks, trails, burrows, even coprolites. You use that technical term for kids, and then when you tell them it's fossil dung, they go, ooh, when you passed out a specimen of a coprolite. So this is a typical fossil fish. And the first thing we need to ask ourselves before going into detail about the fossilization process itself, how do fossils form? That's a good question because you go to many museums and textbooks and they have lots of drawings and ideas, but it's easy to do an experiment yourself to show that those ideas just don't work. For example, we often get told that a fish dies, then it sinks slowly down through the water to the bottom of the lake or the ocean, lands on the ocean floor, where it's slowly covered up by sand or mud, and it's buried. And after burial, it slowly turns into a fossil. Notice the emphasis on slow and gradual. So is that how fossils are formed? These are the sorts of pictures you get. Well, it's obvious that you don't see all the dead fish on the bottom of the ocean waiting to be fossilised, do you? Because they rot, many of them float, are eaten by scavengers. By the time they get to the bottom of the ocean or a lake, they're an ooey-gooey sticky mess. So how does a fossil fish like this one form? Think about it. It's obvious, isn't it? When you really stop to think about it, that can't have been slow and gradual. Something like this was going on. Before he had time to finish his breakfast, the two of them were buried and fossilised. I mean, it has to be catastrophic. And we all know that animals and plants decay after dying. There's always bacteria that are around, even when there's no oxygen. You'll go to some textbooks and museums and they'll say, oh, if you don't have oxygen, things will be slow and gradual and it'll take a lot more time. No, even when there's no oxygen, there are bacteria that don't need oxygen to survive that are involved in the decay process. So it means that you must have rapid burial to preserve animals and plants to become fossils. And we see numerous examples of this, and we like to point people to them. That's why we have the real things. People often ask in the museum, if they see me there, they pull me up and say, are the fossils on display real? They sure are. The fossils in the museum, our creation museum, are not replicas, apart from some in the dinosaur hall, of course, but many of those that are around the walls are the real thing. But we're hoping we'll have a real dinosaur fossil soon to have on display, some more real stuff. But here's a marine reptile 6 feet long, preserved, having just given birth to a little baby. See the little baby there with the arrow? I mean, mother, if she had time to sense danger, could have swam away. But no, she gave birth to that little one and they were instantly buried under tons of sand and mud. Here's a fossil jellyfish. I mean, everybody knows a jellyfish is soft, it melts in the sun or gets ripped apart by the wind and the waves. You need rapid processes for these to be preserved like that. And crinoids. Crinoids, this is rare to find them with the heads. Most time, as I'll show you later, you find them broken up stems or columns and the discs that make up those columns. It's very rare to find the head. Now, a crinoid is a sea lily. It's an animal. It's not a plant. And it has fronds that it uses, and they're in a head, and you can see those heads beautifully preserved. But it's rare to find them, but when you do, you know it has to be rapid burial and preservation. A fossilised wasp. I mean, look at the state of preservation of the wings with the venation still there. It has to have been rapid, otherwise a creature like that would have rotted and decayed away. And here we have a fossilised flower. I mean, how do you fossilise a flower slowly? It has to be rapid burial before decay can set in. A trilobite. Many of these creatures are the earliest fossils in the fossil record, and they're beautifully preserved, intact, with all these details, even the details of their eyes, their lens system in their eyes. So, how does fossilisation occur? Well, there are several ways in which fossilisation occurs. You can have the unaltered remains are preserved. Many people are familiar with petrification or permineralisation. That's where other minerals permeate into the structure of the buried organism, into the bones and shell, and petrify it. And we'll do more details on each of these. This is just an overview here. Preservation by recrystallization. After burial, the mineral that makes up the bone or the shell recrystallizes, or it may be replaced. We have only sometimes the original is gone, but we're left with a mould or a cast of the shape of the critter. Sometimes everything's gone except the carbon that was in the body that remains as a film on the rock, and that film preserves the shape and the features of the buried organism. And then there are tracks and trails that are often preserved, where the animal has scurried across the surface, left behind the details of its passage across that surface, and it's been preserved for us. And we can tell a lot, by the way, about creatures by what leaves behind. People do that today. They study the footprints and they can work out what animal it was and what they were doing, and you can do that with the fossil footprints as well, and tracks. Here's a quote from an evolutionist, a long-age evolutionist, an expert on fossils, Philip Currie. Was at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Canada. He said this: bones do not have to be turned into stone to be fossils, and usually most of the original bone is still preserved in a dinosaur fossil. So many dinosaur fossils, we have the unaltered remains are preserved. The original bone can still be there. And of course you can tell that if the fossil is quite porous and light. If it's turned to stone, of course it becomes rather heavy from all the extra minerals that have permeated into the bone and crystallised there. And examples of preserved unaltered remains include mammoths frozen in tundra mud. You're familiar with those. Animals trapped in oil or tar seeps or pits. So if you go to Los Angeles, you can go to the La Brea tar pits and see creatures that have been preserved, the unaltered remains in oil and the tar seeps. Insects and flowers can be preserved in amber, which is fossil tree resin. And of course, even DNA has been recovered from some of these fossils in the amber. For example, termites in Dominican amber. Of course, the termites are supposed to be millions of years old, and the biologists are puzzled as to how the DNA could survive fossilised for all that time. Well, they've never considered that maybe it wasn't that old after all. We even find shells where the original mother-of-pearl iridescence is still preserved to show that the original shell is still there. And so here's an example of some of the insects that we see beautifully preserved in amber, fossil tree resin. And it enables paleontologists to study these insects, and you know what they invariably find? They're the same as the insects alive today. They've stayed the same. They haven't evolved into something else. These insects have always been insects. They've always been wasps. They've always been scorpions, as in the middle one there. So unaltered remains is the first way that animals can be preserved as fossils. The most common type of fossil is where we have permineralization or petrification. Most people know it as petrification. It's where shells and plants and bones, of course, they contain pores and canals. I mean, the bones where the canals where the blood vessels went through, so there's space for solutions in groundwaters. The soft tissue decays, the soft part like the blood vessels can decay, and the nerves, and water in the sediment where the shells and plants and bones have been buried will fill those former soft part areas. And so the water contains dissolved chemicals such as silica and calcium carbonate or lime. And so when water in those pores and canals starts to concentrate there, those chemicals concentrate, the water can dry out, and the chemicals precipitate, and they fill those, crystallise, and they fill those spaces and petrify the shells, plants, and bones. A familiar example, of course, is petrified logs or permineralised logs, such in the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, east of Flagstaff. But I'm sure you've all seen many examples of fossil wood like that, not necessarily as beautifully colourful as that, but petrified wood is very common, and the woody structure has been replaced or infilled and replaced with this silica material. So that's the most common type of preservation of fossils. Then another way it can be preserved is recrystallization. When the buried shells are infiltrated by water, the water contains lime or calcium carbonate. The shells also contain calcium carbonate. And what happens is that some of that shell material dissolves, but because there's so much calcium carbonate in the water, it recrystallizes. So what we see today is not the original shell crystals, but the same material has reformed and preserved the original shell for us. And so it's a replacement process. It's recrystallization. It's the same chemical that you had originally, but it's not the original form in which those crystals were. But you've still got the shape of the creature like the shellfish preserved, such as this brachiopod or lamp shell. The original shell material has recrystallized, but it looks for all the world the same on the outside as the original shell. Then there is replacement. Water seeps into the shells and bones, carrying these minerals into solution. The water dissolves the shells and bones, but the minerals in the solution precipitate or crystallize in place of the shells and the bones. And so this new mineral substitutes or replaces the original shell or bone material. Now, often the replacement mineral is silica. By the way, silica is the same thing that's in window glass. It crystallizes to a mineral we call quartz or chalcedony. They're varieties of the same derived from silica. but sometimes it can be pyrite or iron sulfide, or even hematite, which is that cherry red coloured iron oxide mineral. So in this case, we have a fossil nautilus shell, which was originally calcium carbonate. It's been replaced by silica. And in fact, the chalcedony with the impurities gives it that colour. Beautiful, beautiful way of preservation. But that's replacement of the original shell. Then there are moulds and casts. So what happens is the groundwater passing through the sediments can dissolve the shells or bones completely, but there's a void left in the sediment, and those voids form as a result of everything being dissolved out, and either mud or the empty spaces there preserves that shape, either as a mould or as, if it's infilled with something else, a cast. And so the cast is a replica of the original. It duplicates the original shell or bone. So even the features can be preserved in these moulds and casts. So for example, here we have a mould of a fossil flatworm. The impression is still there. If you were to get plaster of Paris to fill in that mould, you'd have a replica of that surface. You'd have the cast produced from that mould out of your plaster of Paris. And in this case, this is the inside of a coiled snail or gastropod. You can see the inner part of the coiled shell has been infilled with this lime mud, and the shell is gone, but all you're left with is the internal cast. And that's common. That's also common. Then there's preservation by carbon only. And plants are often preserved only as thin films of carbon pressed between the bedding planes of the sedimentary rock layers. So when they're buried, they're pressed. It's like a flower press. You know, you get the felt pads and you put the flower in between it, or the plant, and you apply pressure, you end up squashing it. Well, that's what happens in the ground, but the original plant material, of course, decays, and then you only get the carbon left, and you get a carbon film or carbon residue left behind. And so that carbon film can preserve with great fidelity the original leaves, the stems, or even the fruits of the plants can be preserved by these carbon films. The same can happen with the soft parts of marine animals. The bacterial decay may have been inhibited by lack of oxygen, but the carbon film is left there to preserve the soft details. So here we have an example of a plant fossil where the original plant structure, the leaves, is being preserved by the carbon that's left behind after decay has occurred. And then there's preservation of traces and tracks and trails. Animals scurry or walk across a sediment surface, leaves behind their trails or footprints. Sediments cover it in, they're buried, and the sediments harden that hold those forms, buried, they're preserved. And so we can actually find evidence of where animals were living and moving around even during the flood. They were still scurrying around trying to escape the floodwaters and leaving behind footprints and other trails, and these have been preserved for us. And these are called trace fossils. Of course, the paleontologists like to get fancy names, ichnofossils, but they're just traces of creatures. So, for example, we find fossilised worm escape burrows. So they're U-shaped. The creature was burying down and suddenly realised it was getting buried too deeply by more sediment accumulating, so it did a U-turn and tried to escape. Notice that? And fossilised worm trails. I mean, look at the trails there. These creatures were trying to move around in the chaos of what was going on during the flood, and these trails were left behind. We have fossilised trilobite trails scurrying along with their little appendages outside of that shell, and they'd heap up the sand or mud, and they leave behind those trails. Fossilised amphibian footprints. You can see their toe prints even, and claw marks, and you can see where they're climbing up a surface, they're pushing back. And dinosaur footprints. There are many places around the world where we find dinosaur footprints. Even just outside Jerusalem in Israel. Fossilised dinosaur footprints in a marine limestone, which sort of begs the question, what were dinosaurs doing in a marine environment when they live on the land? Well, it's obvious, because the ocean waters flooded over the continent, so they were caught by the ocean waters, leaving behind their footprints in the lime sand that was accumulating up on the continent. Well, the next question is, what about the rate of these processes? Does it take millions of years like the textbooks say? No. We're going to look at it quickly at a number of processes. There's silicification, where silica is involved, phosphatization, where phosphate is involved, calcium phosphate, the material that's in your bones is calcium phosphate, biofilms of iron oxide or carbon, pyritization, where iron sulfide replaces the material, fossilises, and coalification. Let's quickly run through these. Silifications. Everyone knows that it's a rapid process. It's been demonstrated in the laboratory. You put wood in a solution of silica, and the silica enters into the cell walls of the woody structure, and the cell walls are simultaneously replaced by silica, as also the voids within the cell walls. And even the cellular structure of the wood is preserved. And of course, you only have to harden it all you have to do is dry it out. So experiments have been done. And for example, wooden blocks were lowered into Yellowstone hot springs that were filled with silica. And the silicification, petrification process took place as the silica penetrated into that wood at a rate of a fraction of an inch per year, up to something like a quarter of an inch per year. But you can do it in the laboratory in just a matter of 24 hours. If you have the right temperature and the right solutions and concentrations of solutions. In fact, the Japanese did an experiment. And what excited me about this experiment, in the report of the experiment, they actually quoted from and referenced articles I'd written in Creation magazine. And that was in a secular publication. What they did in these Japanese scientists, they suspended pieces of wood in hot volcanic spring water, like had been done at Yellowstone National Park. And they had a number of these pieces of wood, and they took them out at different times over a 7-year period to examine the rate or the progress of the silicification. And they discovered that after 7 years, nearly 40% of the wood had been totally infiltrated by silica and preserved as petrified wood. And so we can see under the microscope how the silica, Si, has infilled the cellular structure, the walls, and also the voids within that cellular structure. And it's well documented in the literature. There's also anecdotal evidence of natural petrification processes. Forgive me for quoting from our native Australia, but a piece of wood was chopped down from a tree and buried in soil in southwestern Queensland for 70 years, and when dug up, it was petrified, with the axe marks preserved and petrified. Up in far north Queensland, where it's very tropical, like southern Florida, trees buried in silt by a flood in 1918, when exposed 32 years later, had the surviving portions of their trunks totally petrified. So we know these processes. The scientific community knows that these processes are rapid indeed. And it's not only wood, but also other materials can be preserved by silica, like bacteria. You can even petrify bacteria rapidly in silica solutions. The same process happens in situ in natural spring waters. It's been observed, just like these volcanic hot springs. And you can do experiments in the laboratory to show that you can link the experiments to the real thing by comparing what you produce in the laboratory with what we find preserved in the rock record. So, for example, a quote from, again, an evolutionist about this process, so you know that it's not just coming from creationists. Fossilization is a process that can take anything from a few hours to millions of years. That's from his perspective, but they know it can take a few hours. The amount of time that it takes for a bone to become completely permineralised or petrified is highly variable. If the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, the process can happen rapidly. Well, of course, during the flood, there was abundant water full of minerals, with all that volcanic activity, laden with minerals. Therefore, there's no impediment to rapid fossilization, petrification during the flood year. In fact, we see examples of fossilized bacteria that have been silicified, petrified in the rock, and we know from all our observations in the real world that experiments that can be repeated, that these processes are rapid. What about phosphatization? Our bones are made up of calcium phosphate. The mineral name is called apatite. And in the fossil record, there are some remarkable fossils where cellular details of even soft tissues have been preserved as a result of replacement by calcium phosphate. Now, it's always been assumed that the process requires elevated phosphate concentrations in the sediment waters, but experiments in the laboratory with decaying shrimps, they became partially mineralised by the calcium phosphate, preserving the cellular details in high fidelity, even muscle tissues within weeks. And so here's an example from the fossil record of fossil fish soft tissues that are being preserved. Gill tissues on the left, muscle tissues on the right. The state of preservation is remarkable, and it bespeaks of rapid processes, and we know from the laboratory experiments that this can happen. In fact, it's even been demonstrated that you can have the living creature in the solutions. As long as you make the solutions concentrated enough, the creature virtually gets fossilised alive. While it's still there in the solutions, the replacement process is taking place and is petrifying while it's still alive. Incredible. Biofilms, biological films, in other words, it's a shortened term. So bacteria rapidly colonise leaf surfaces and form biofilms within days of leaves falling into water. And experiments with leaves of living counterparts of plant fossils have been preserved by iron oxide, that's rust colour, that because the bacteria has been able to absorb the iron, which reacts with oxygen to make the iron oxides, and it preserves in detail, great detail and fidelity, the original structures in the plants. And we all know that this can take place within a few days. It's a very rapid process. And that's why we see in the fossil record examples like this. Fossilization of a flower and its foliage. You can see the iron oxide coating there. But that film has preserved in great detail the original structures. Then there's pyritization. The mineral pyrite or iron sulfide or fool's gold, because it has a golden yellow colour, it can actually preserve animal soft tissues. It's relatively rare, but it does happen. It's more common with plants. And experiments show, again, microbes are involved in this process. They mediate the chemical process by collecting the iron and using the sulfur available in solutions to combine the iron and the sulfur to iron sulfide. And it's an extremely rapid process in the laboratory. Now, you might say 80 days, that's relatively long, but how long was the flood anyway? We've got a whole year to do these things, so plenty of time to accomplish these sorts of processes. The decomposition of the cell walls occurs, but the pyrite or iron sulfide is directly precipitated to replace those cell walls and then fills in the void spaces between the cells, just as we saw in that photograph under the microscope of the fossil wood. And it can happen within weeks. So here we see, for example, a pyritized arthropod fossil. That's from a German fossil deposit. The original arthropod, something like a wormy thing, was replaced by pyrite. And then there's coalification. We're all familiar with that because we've all seen coal. Buried trees and sediments under temperatures and elevated pressures of deep burial lose water and gases and are converted to coal. In other words, the carbon is concentrated. So, the other things like the oxygen and hydrogen that help to form the structure in the plant material is taken out of the system, and you're just left with the elevated carbon content. Time and pressure are not the main factors in the coalification process, especially the time. We know it can happen rapidly in the laboratory with experiments under moderate temperatures, under the right chemical conditions. That's the crucial factors. Woody materials can be converted to coal within weeks. And if you have clay minerals present, they actually catalyse the chemical processes so that it happens at just the confining pressures under moderate temperatures. And so we see lots of examples of coalified wood or tree stumps in the laboratory. That's a famous occurrence in Glasgow in Scotland of these fossilised tree stumps that have been coalified. So, where are fossils found? Well, fossils are found in many water-deposited sedimentary rocks, some of continental extent, as we'll show you in a minute. But notice the emphasis is on water-deposited sedimentary rocks. And the fossils are found often in successive sedimentary layers in any one region. And often they're in large numbers of fossils. We call them graveyards. When you get lots of dead things buried together, we call it a graveyard. Well, we have fossil graveyards. And they're often well preserved due to the rapid burial under catastrophic conditions. As Ken is wont to say, and Buddy sings, billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. That sums it up, doesn't it? That's easy to remember, isn't it? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Sounds like there was a lot of water covering the earth at one time, wasn't there? Now, don't be confused when you see this diagram in museums and textbooks called the fossil record. Many people think that the evolutionists are showing how one creature changed into another. No, this is the order in which the creatures were buried during the flood, that's all. And in fact, the rock layers in which the fossils are found are real. You can hit them with a hammer, you can get a sample if you're not in a national park. And if the highway patrol doesn't pull you up at the road cut on the interstate. And you can trace those local rock sequences. You can go from southern Kentucky through to northern Kentucky, and you can step up through, actually you're stepping down through a sequence of layers, and you can follow that order. That order is the same if you go on some other side roads as well as the main interstate. And some of these local sequences can be connected around regions, and I'll show you examples of these, and even between continents. So don't be afraid of these diagrams in textbooks. They're based on reality. They've just been interpreted in terms of millions of years. They've been interpreted in terms of slow processes. They've been interpreted in terms of evolution. But we know from the scriptures, the eyewitness account, that the correct interpretation is catastrophic burial during the flood. All it is a layer stacked up rapidly during the flood, burying creatures at different levels. And so the fossils contained in those rock sequences do follow the order of the fossil record, except there are always many more fossils than the ones depicted in those diagrams. You know, you see the dinosaur fossils at a certain level in those diagrams, but what they don't tell you, you often find marine fossils buried with the dinosaurs. Isn't that interesting? But wouldn't you expect that in a flood when the ocean waters covered the continents? Of course you would. Ocean creatures would be buried with land creatures. And so there's a mixture often in the fossil record. So let's go to the Grand Canyon, for example. You see, the sequence is real because you can start at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and right down there in the Colorado River, it's the narrowest part of the river right there at Granite Narrows. We're down in the basement rocks of the Grand Canyon, the foundation rocks of the continent, and then above that are the flood layers. And you can walk up the walls of the canyon, up a trail, of course, and you can go up through these layers. You're actually walking up through the record of the flood. You get to the top of the Grand Canyon, and you start going up further north towards Utah. You go up through the Grand Staircase, another 10,000 feet of sedimentary layers. You've got the Vermilion Cliffs. You've got the White Cliffs in Zion National Park, 2,000 foot thick Navajo sandstone. And you go all the way up to the Pink Cliffs at Bryce Canyon at the end of the flood. So you actually can walk through this real sequence of rock layers that represent the record of the flood. So the rock layer sequences are real, and the fossils are in those layers. So you start down the bottom of the Grand Canyon where you got no fossils because there was no flood. When God created, there was no life to begin with when he created the land. And then the flood begins suddenly with a layer where you see devastation, the great unconformity. And then you build up the flood layers, and you've got all these fossils found in them. And so we go on all the way to the top. And so the fossil record is real. And ultimately, what I need to remind you is that most of the fossils are actually marine fossils. Shallow water marine invertebrates like clams and corals make up 95% of the fossil record. By the way, that means the pre-flood world must have been a beautiful place. The oceans today are a desert by comparison to what it must have been like. Now, fossil graveyards, we find all these fossils in accumulations, large accumulations in a single sedimentary layer, sometimes over a confined area, but sometimes over a regional continent. These are fossil graveyards. They're jumbled masses of creatures that were obviously buried catastrophically by destructive, moving water. By the way, we're in the Grand Canyon just 2 weeks ago, and one of the examples we showed our guests was where there'd been a flood in a side canyon last year. And they were amazed to see boulders the size of this piano that had been flushed out of that side canyon and dumped on the beach by the Colorado River. It lets people understand the power of moving water. And if that can happen in a little localised flash flood from a local thunderstorm, imagine water all around the earth for 40 days and 40 nights of torrential rainfall and the fountains bursting out water. It must have been a terribly terrible event, because we see the record of this God's judgment in these fossil graveyards. They sometimes represent groups of creatures that may have lived elsewhere together, that were swept away and then buried together. Because where do we find them today? Buried together. It's not where they lived, is it? We don't know that's where they lived, but we know where they are buried because we see them today where they are buried. So let's quickly give you some examples so you can see how powerful this evidence is. When we start with God's word and understand how this evidence fits, it's exciting. We can show people these examples locally, regionally, and even globally of fossil graveyards. Oh, well, let's start with a local example. We're in southern Israel, in the Negev desert, in the Negev. And at Maktesh Ramon, there's this area called the Ammonite Wall. Now, just so you can see, I've got an arrow there with a buoy for scale, so you get your eyes focused. Now we're going to zoom in and see what all these bumps on this rock face are. They're ammonite fossils. They're coiled marine invertebrates. A creature lived in the coiled shell, named after the Ammonites in the Bible, of course. So that's a local, just a localised area, but no one's seen how far it extends because there's only one main exposure. And then if you've been to Dinosaur National Monument, at the wall, you can see this jumbled mass of dinosaur bones. And it's where the dinosaurs were devastated and smashed up, and their bones were plastered together, deposited together and preserved like that. So we see examples of these local fossil graveyards. Well, let's ramp up the scale. Now we're going to go to the Illinois Basin. And there's Francis Creek Shale, which extends across the Illinois Basin. It's between some of the coal beds that have been mined by strip mines. And in the Mason Creek area of the Illinois Basin, and you can see where that is on the map, in these former strip mines, you can still go in and collect interesting fossils. In fact, this is a world-class fossil location, and I'm pleased to say that we have been getting fossils from this area, and we'll be, of course, writing all this up so that it's available to document perhaps a future display of these fossils that we have in our collections at the museum, the Creation Museum. So that the Creation Museum is a working research institution as well as a displaying of the things that we have. So here's Mason Creek in the foreground, and there's the Francis Creek Shale that's in the cliff line along the creek. Now, within the former strip mines, there are spoil heaps. Of course, many of them are vegetated over. The strip mines have become, the former pits have become lakes, been filled with water, but you can still see in the debris these concretions, nodules. And I'll explain a little bit about those to those who come on the field trip this afternoon about concretions, because you'll see some on our trip. And when you break open these concretions, you find magnificent fossils. It's because of the organic material in the fossil has attracted the chemical solutions around them that precipitate to form these nodules. And so we have plants, Pachypterus. Again, the original material is gone, but the impression there is left for us to see. We have the ones I showed you before, preserved by a biofilm, Sphenophyllum, another plant. We find clams in these nodules. We even find crustaceans, the remains of them. And here's some photographs of some better examples. A crustacean on the left. We even find a spider in some of these concretions, beautifully preserved by the calcium carbonate replacement in these nodules. We find millipedes. And it's over a large area. This was originally the Francis Creek Shale, of course, extends right through the coal measures of the Illinois Basin. So we're talking about a regional scale of all these creatures beautifully preserved in this fossil graveyard. And then there's Tully Monstrum, or nicknamed the Tully Monster, that they're still not sure what it was, but there's an incredible array of these beautifully preserved creatures on a grand scale over a region, a fossil graveyard over a region. I couldn't not tell you about the Cincinnati area. You can see there where the Creation Museum is in the orbital I-275 freeway around Greater Cincinnati. And of course, you know that the Creation Museum is at exit 11 when you go up to 75. from Knoxville, and you just hang a left at the 275 and go 11 miles. But if you turn to the right, instead of going to, you go to exit a couple of exits along, you can go off onto a side road, and there's a beautiful exposure and a road cut where you won't get pulled over by the highway patrol, and you can go for your heart's content looking at the fossils in the Fairview Formation in what is known as the Cincinnati Arch. And here's this road cut. We take people to it sometimes, visitors to the museum, and here we look up close. Here's the road cut. You can see those hard layers are limestone, and in between you've got mud or shale, mudstone or shale. Because the mudstone decomposes and bits of the limestone fall out because they're undercut by the mudstone going back to mud. And you'll see that on a lot of the road cuts on the 75 up to the museum, where you've got limestones and shales alternating. The shales weather out. In fact, if you go up north of Knoxville, you'll see where it's very carbon-rich shale. It's almost like coal in one of the road cuts. The limestones are full of fossils. Here we see an example. Corals, clams, crinoids, all smashed up and broken and compacted together. You can't see the details on that scale. You've got to get up real close, as in this photograph where you can see the clams, lots of clams. By the way, you see the individual shells of clams. Do clams live as individual shells? No, they live as two shells that open and shut. When you see all these broken up individual shells, you know you're not looking at the living environment, you're looking at where the creatures were buried. And it's on a mass scale. The Fairview Formation goes right through the Cincinnati area, and it goes right down deep. The Cincinnati area is in an arch where there's been a dome, and you've had at the top eroded off. The same layers that are exposed around the Creation Museum, which is built on a fossil graveyard. Isn't that interesting? And those layers dip down to the north and to the south on the edges of that arch. So this fossil graveyard goes for a large area, a regional extent through the Midwest. And bryozoans, lace corals, are also found, and lots of other marine creatures. So that's a regional scale. So that's two examples of regional scale. Let's pump it up to another level. Let's look at a continental scale. In the Grand Canyon, we have the red wall limestone. You can see why they call it the red wall limestone, don't you? It's a limestone that makes a red wall. That's because of the rust or iron oxide on the surface of the cliff. And this is what it looks like down in the Grand Canyon on the Colorado River. It forms a red wall. And it's actually full of fossils, masses of these, crinoids or sea lilies, bryozoans, lace corals. These are animals, but they build skeletons in the shape of a plant or in the shape of a lace. And we don't often find them incomplete. We find them broken up. The stems or columns are made up of discs and they're broken up. The brachiopod I mentioned before is in that fossil graveyard. Lots of corals. I mean, they're every which way preserved in the limestone. Up close, you can see the shape. Colonial corals, solitary corals, all broken up, smashed up, and in a huge mass graveyard. We even find nautiloid fossils up to 6 feet long. You all know the coiled nautilus. This is a straight shell nautiloid. It was an animal like a squid that had a shell that kept on building longer and longer shells as long as it lived. Now, most people don't realise that the same red wall limestone that's found in the Grand Canyon, you can trace it to other areas. Now, here's a chart. I'll walk you through this. You see the Grand Canyon on the bottom right there, the label, it's arrowing the local vertical, that vertical column where that arrow is pointing is the layer sequence in the Grand Canyon, and the red wall limestone blue there is arrowed. See that? Now, if you look across to the left, you can see a narrow arrow right over to the left there. See those blue patches go all the way across that chart? That's all the different local columns in local other areas nearby the Grand Canyon over a whole region of the Great Basin out west. You can see that the Redwall limestone can be traced to other areas. It's not called the Redwall limestone, it's given other names, but it can be traced. You know what? We come to the chart in the Cincinnati area, and guess what? We can find the same blue patch. See that up there? All the local columns, and yet the equivalent of the Redwall, that blue area, goes almost right across there with a few broken areas where you've had erosion. So the interesting thing is that the equivalence of the Redwall limestone in Arizona can be seen in Wyoming, in Tennessee, in Pennsylvania, in the Appalachians. In fact, in the Shenandoah Valley, the limestone where the caverns are is the same as the Redwall limestone in the Grand Canyon. But these same limestone beds can be seen in England with the same fossils and the same features, and even in the Himalayas, or Himalayas, depending how you want to pronounce it. So here's the Madison limestone in Wyoming, because the local geologist gave it a different name, but it's the same Redwall limestone. And even in the Himalayas, the limestone with the same fossils at the same level in the strata sequence is the Redwall limestone equivalent. Right across North America to other continents, with marine fossils on a continental-wide scale where the ocean waters flooded the continents. My last example, the chalk beds. Everyone's familiar with the cliff line of the English Channel White Cliffs of Dover. These are chalk. Under the microscope, it's actually a fossil graveyard of trillions of microscopic little shellfish. Trillions! Now, the geologists say that these accumulate a fraction of an inch per year, and 1,000 years you might be lucky to get an inch of these creatures living and dying to make an ooze on the ocean floor, and yet these chalk cliffs are over 1,000 feet high. The chalk layers are over 1,000 feet thick. Did it take millions of years to form? No. Look at the fossils we find in the chalk beds. Did this ammonite hang around for millions of years waiting to be covered up by these fossil graveyard, buried slowly? Of course not. I'll give you more examples that will make it even harder for those to talk about millions of years, because you see, these chalk beds, not only found in southern England, but they can be traced across to Northern Ireland, they can be traced across Europe, to Egypt, to Turkey, to Israel, Kazakhstan. The same chalk beds are found in the Midwest US from Nebraska to Texas, and in southern Western Australia, with the same fossils, the same layers above, the same layers below. Here in Israel, we have the chalk beds in the Valley of Elah. That's the brook that David picked his stones from to slay Goliath. The Valley of Elah, chalk beds from the flood. Underneath the Temple Mount is limestone. On the Mount of Olives is chalk. Fossil graveyards, the same chalk layers as in the chalk cliffs of southern England. And this is what the limestone looks like, a sample taken from right at the foundations of the old city wall. You can see it's full of fossils. It's a fossil graveyard. What about the chalk beds here in the Midwest, the Niobrara chalk in Kansas? And it's the same chalk that we see there in the White Cliffs of Dover, a continental scale between continents, global. Here it is, an outcrop. Now, watch the fossils that are found in this chalk that the geologists say accumulated slowly and gradually over millions of years. Tell me if these fossils would have taken millions of years to form. Well, first of all, we have crinoids. Look at the state of preservation of the heads of those crinoids, not broken up, preserved so rapidly in full. What about this? A fish inside another fish. The meal hasn't even been digested and buried in this chalk. A turtle. How do you fossilise a turtle slowly in this chalk ooze? A plesiosaur, 10 feet long, preserved in the chalk, these chalk beds. Ichthyosaur, huge creatures. A dinosaur, a land-dwelling creature in chalk. Or what about a bird? How do you fossilise a bird slowly and preserve it so well in a layer that's supposed to have taken millions of years to accumulate? No, friends. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laden up by water all over the earth. The fossil record, the fossil beds, and the fossilization scream rapid, catastrophic processes on a dynamic scale right around the earth in rock layers buried by moving water. Doesn't it remind you of what Genesis says? And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole of the heaven were covered. The water prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. All flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. No, friends, the fossil record, when we start with God's word as our authoritative eyewitness account of the earth's history, when we look at the fossil beds, the evidence in them is consistent with the global cataclysmic Genesis flood. It explains the catastrophic burial of the creatures and plants, their rapid fossilization, the formation of them in beds, and particularly fossil graveyards that are not only local, but regional, to continental scale, to almost global scale with those chalk beds. So you see, it's exciting and fun to look at the fossil record, but we have to remember it reminds us of the consequences of our sin and the judgment that God sent as the penalty for that sin. Yes, fossils are fun to study in the light of God's word, and by the way, as I close, it also reminds us that God is merciful, because even in judgment, God was burying all those plants that would become the coal and the oil and other resources that we'd need to use in the post-flood world.